set up the mute automation for the Fiddler on the Roof show that we've been working on in the previous videos. And we're going to use the X32 edit software to do that. For these videos, I'm using the Windows version of this software. The Apple Mac software is very similar, looks a little nicer, but I don't have the Apple software available to record these videos, so that's why I'm showing it to you on the Windows version. Okay, so this here is the show control window. You get to that in the software by clicking on this icon here, Cues, and it comes up like this, and it has 4 sections. You can see up here they have separate tabs for them. They're called Cues, Scenes, Snippets, and Mixer Saves. The 2 sections that we're going to use to create the mute automation for the channels are going to be the snippet section and the cues section. Okay, so it's snippets and cues. And the way this works is that in snippets, that's where you actually set partial board settings. So let me step back one more step so that you understand a little bit of the architecture of why things are the way they are in the software and why we're using snippets and cues and not scenes, which is kind of like what you would think. So the big difference between scenes and snippets is that scenes have always the entire settings, everything in the board included in it. You can set certain sections to be protected from being included in the settings that are saved, that are stored, so that you can keep certain settings the same, even though you're loading another different set of overall settings on top of them. But generally speaking, scenes incorporate the entire settings of the board, whereas snippets are very selective. You can select only a few parameters that you want to have affected and actually stored in the snippet. And that means that the main settings, so for example, the gains, the EQ settings for each channel, the compression settings, so everything that's stored in the entire board is not going to be overwritten every time you load a new snippet into the board. And the other effect that this has is that when you load a new scene, the entire sound output of the board is actually going to be muted for a brief moment to load all the entirety of the settings in there, and then it's unmuted. So it would be unpractical to load in settings via scenes when you're in progress and you need to have continuous sound output. Okay, that's why we're using snippets and not scenes. Okay, and then the cues section is this is where the actual switch happens, where you select for each scene or for each scene in the show, for every time you want to change settings, this would be considered a cue, and you can then name that cue here and load a snippet or a scene or even both. But in our case, so for our application, the way we use it is we set up every time we want to make a change, we set this up in cue, and then we load a certain snippet into by doing that into the cue. All right. Now this makes it a little bit complicated or a little bit inconvenient to kind of navigate back and forth here as you're setting things up between snippets and cues. But there are some internal reasons for that, and so mainly one big reason is that with the snippets you have a limitation to something like, you can have 100 snippets, so 100 different settings can be queued up, but you can reuse the snippet. So if you have, for example, a setting for mute all, that's always what I have in here as the first one. When I have a snippet for mute all, I don't have to recreate that every time I want to mute everyone. I can call the same snippet up in cues. You can see here, first cue is always my mute all, and then at the end I always have mute all as well. So, and however many times in between, whenever you have a blackout or when between scenes, you just need to mute everyone, you want to use the same snippet, and that saves snippets. And so you can reuse snippets that way. Okay, so with that said, let me show you what we usually store with the mutes and with the snippets. I mean, with the snippets, okay? So we're going to unselect. So first of all, we're going to unselect source and scribble. Scribble is this, you know, the name and the icon. And so whatever is on the channel here, that is being saved with this here, source and scribble. So you can, so the way this works here is that you have to select the whatever it is that you want to store with the scribble. The parameters that you want to store have to be checked like this. Okay, so we want to not set groups in this case. We don't want to set. We only want to set mutes, and that's all that we want to do for parameters. We only want to automate mutes. Okay, we're going to really keep it simple here, and then here you can select or unselect what you want to even control. So in this case, we only want to control all of the 16 input channels, the main channels. We don't want to control the buses, and we don't want to control the DCA groups except for DCA group number 8. Okay, that's the one, remember, that we're setting aside for vocal reverb. And I'm going to show you a real easy way to control this. And for that purpose, we're going to actually automate DCA group 8. Okay, so now we're going to actually save that, override snippet, mute all. Okay, great. So now, very good. That's our mute all group. Now, as we move forward here, let me actually do this. Let me move this out of the way a little bit, because we're going to have a slightly easier time than reading through the script again by going through here. And for every scene, we're going to select we're going to set up the board and then save that as a scene or as a snippet. So the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to set up each scene the way that I extracted the information from the script in this spreadsheet here. And then I'm going to refine it by going through the script again and creating entrances and exits for each scene, because sometimes in a scene you have that started only with 1 or 2 characters, and then the others are still off stage and later they come in. So we don't want to have them all unmuted for the entire scene while they're still while actors are still backstage, but rather we want to mute and unmute mics as they come on stage and leave the stage. So we're going to refine that later, but for now I'm going to go through, and for every scene I'm going to create a snippet, and I'm going to set the board exactly the way that it needs to be set for this particular scene. All right. So first off, let's just start by unmuting Tevye by himself. That's actually going to be a real prominent setting. So we're going to have Tevye speaking. When the Tevye speaks, the reverb should be muted. So we're going to unmute channel 1 and mute the reverb channel, and then create a new snippet here and call it Tevye Talks. And I'm going to hit save snippet Tevye Talks. And right here, I'm just going to, and it actually goes in right the same way. I'm going to then, so here we go. So prologue is just Tevye alone. He just says a couple of lines, and then starts the big opening song, Tradition. So Tradition, Tevye is still by himself, singing by himself. So in this case, we want to turn the reverb on. So it's just going to be Tevye by himself, but the reverb needs to be unmuted. So we're going to unmute reverb over here, and then go ahead and save this as Tevye sings. All right, save. Tevye sings. All right, now when we're here, I've had some weird, funky things happen with the software. So before I go any further, I'm actually going to check if this is working the way it should by double-clicking the snippet and saying, okay, load snippet, mute all. And you can see Tevye is muted and reverb is unmuted. That's fine. Now, Tevye talks, I'm going to double-click and click OK. That unmutes Tevye and mutes the reverb. And then Tevye sings is Tevye is still by himself and the reverb is also unmuted. Okay, so unfortunately for this next section here, I muted the original. I had the microphone muted when I did the original recording. So I'm just going to, instead of re-recording it, I'm just going to narrate a little bit through this part here and see that we hopefully can make this usable for you. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm showing you the snippets that I've created for the entire first scene and all the way through the Matchmaker song. So they're all set up in the snippets tab right now, and I'm about to walk you through setting them up inside the cues tab. So this is how you can check here. I'm showing here how you double click on the snippet, it gets loaded, you click OK, it gets loaded, and you can see how the settings actually change according to whatever is saved in the snippet. Now this is Tevye sings, the reverb gets unmuted for that because we're going to have an opportunity this way to add reverb. Okay, so this is an interesting case here. I actually made a little mistake. I forgot to unmute channel 16 for the tradition song. So I'm going to show here how to correct an error or if you have to make changes. Basically, you need to make sure that the snippet has been loaded into the board by double-clicking, which we already did that, right? And then you just go into the board. You can do it in the app here, but you can do it actually also on the board itself. So here I'm reloading again tradition. Now you could, if you're sitting on the board while you're doing this, you could simply go in here and unmute correct the error, get the configuration set, and then you just simply come back here to the snippets and save it. All right. So now I'm testing again, loading Tevye sings, and then loading tradition, and you can see now when I load tradition, channel 16 is also unmuted, and that's what we want to do. Now for this tradition song, it's a fairly complicated song. We may end up having to add additional snippets for that, because I don't know at this point if everyone is actually going to be on stage. I'm pretending like that's the case, but that's kind of unlikely. So there's a pretty good chance that we may have to come back here and add additional snippets, but I'm going to show you in a minute that that's actually pretty simple to do. All right, so now I'm going through the individual snippets here. This is the scene 1 snippet, and you can see the configuration of the mutes has changed now. And since it's a dialogue configuration, I'm muting the reverb on the DCA 8. All right, so that's good. Now I'm going to continue there and explaining how the naming scheme here, I'm just simply, for this scene 1, I decided to just use dialogue snippets for the names of the snippets. I mean dialogue snippets, pieces of dialogue for the naming of the snippets. Unfortunately, there's a pretty restrictive character count on the snippet name, so you can't like write novels here or go long on the names to make them more easier to be meaningful. But whatever it is, you can use different methods to make sure that where you need to activate these snippets. And so as I go through and create snippets, I actually also go through the script and just simply make a quick entry, just a little pencil mark as to where another snippet has to be activated. So I'm showing you in this part of the video, I'm showing you through here how these snippets are working and how the settings are changed. You see there's the three girls there are having dialogue prior to the matchmaker song, and then on the matchmaker song they're going to sing together. And you can see here for the dialogue, the reverb is muted, and then once the matchmaker snippet comes on, I'm unmuting the reverb there for you. Okay, so that's so far those are the snippets that I've created so far there. Now let's go over to the cues and actually set up the cues. So the way the cues work, I'm deleting the second mute all here so that I can basically start from scratch with an index 1 cue that is the mute all. I always like to have mute all in the beginning so that I can make sure that everything is muted for the beginning of the show, and then I start here. So so you click on add here where the plus sign is, and then you name the cue that you're creating, and then you go over to the snippets and right click on a Windows, might be something different on the Mac, and you select the snippet that you want to call up with that cue. So in this case, the beginning of the show starts with Tevye Talks. So that's the snippet that I'm going to select there. And then I'm going to add another cue. Now, when you're adding cues, you have an option to add the cues as, you can see here, the index. It can either continue to count, or it can nest the indices, the number here, in two layers of nesting. And in this case, because the tradition is part of the prologue, I'm choosing here to nest it. So I'm going to basically nest the songs within the scenes that they belong to. So tradition starts with everyone singing. Okay, so I'm going to select that. I'm explaining here that yes, so we may have to add additional cues to that depending on how the song is actually going to work out with the mics. That's something that we have to work out on stage when we actually do the rehearsal and have everyone on their mics and everything is mic checked. So we'll decide that later. Okay, so now the next one is actually going to continue. So then scene 1 actually starts. So I'm noticing an error here, calling up scene 1, and then I'm going to go back and rename the name of the cue here in the beginning. The first one is actually called Prologue, and the tradition song is part of the prologue. Now, at the end of the song, we may need to add a mute all, and let's move on first. So in scene 1, so you can basically, go ahead and you have to here create a cue for every change that you want to trigger by advancing the cue list. And it's very simple to do this on the board. It's always the same button. It's kind of like a go button on the board itself that advances to the next cue. And so every change that is happening, I'm setting every change that happens up as a new cue in the cue list. In my previous show, I found that it's more confusing to try and incorporate or do smaller changes. You could kind of think that smaller changes could just be handled manually by hitting a mute button on one of the channels. But I found that it's more confusing to go back and forth between hitting individual mute buttons and simply hitting the go button whenever a change happens. So over the course of several shows in refining my system here, I've decided to just put every change, no matter how small it is, into a cue here, and then I can simply call it up by hitting the go button. This also enables me to mix the entire show from the audience without sitting at the console, then I can, I have a PC that I can use to advance the cue list to the next cue, and I can hold an iPad in the audience room, in the theater, to run the actual mix. So that way I can, remote control the board settings from a PC, from a laptop, and control the mix completely from the iPad, and I don't have to be in the booth for rehearsals or even performances for that matter to be able to advance everything. So that's my general system at this stage of the game, is to set up every single change, every single mute and unmute in here. So now we're done. We've now pulled all the snippets that I've created so far into the cue list, and I'm going to go through here and probably explain how and show how the cues are actually calling up the snippets and how you can step your way through that. All right, I think I've explained enough up to this point. Let's see what is on the end of this video that still needs explanation and commentary because it's missing original audio.